Welcome to another episode of Healing Better Through Movement and Wholeness. I am Dr. Tom Naro, and my guest today is Dr. Castanho. Thanks for coming back on the show.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Now, our listeners may remember you are a naturopath who owns and operates Wholesome Place, located in East Hartford, Connecticut. In our last interview, you taught us about the effectiveness of some home remedies to treat IBS. We talked about laxatives, we talked about some fiber, and how that all works with the body. So what I really want to hear about today are what are the ways people can help themselves identify and then correct some gut problems? Okay, so here's question number one. We'll just go right for it.
Sure.
How can a person tell if a food or drink is not good for their own gut health?
Sure. All right. So this is multifaceted, but let's try to break it down to a couple broad strokes. First thing I would say, fried food on the whole is not going to be great for gut health. The process of frying changes the types of fats that are in the food and can complicate the types of bacteria that we want to have in the GI tract. The more we eat healthy foods, the more we selectively allow the bacteria that then eat the fiber within those foods to survive. Think about the GI tract like a colony of different types of organisms. Some like to eat broccoli, some like to eat Brussels sprouts, others like to eat fried chicken, okay? The more we eat those types of foods that promote the healthy type of bacteria, the more we're actually going to have metabolic byproducts from those bacteria that then make us crave the types of healthy foods. So if we're choosing to consume things with higher sugar levels, fried foods, gluten-containing grains that typically have higher carbohydrate levels and potentially more problematic compounds for the GI tract, we're going to selectively allow those types of bad bacteria to make us then crave that much more bad food. So I would say the first thing at the gate, fried food should be nixed. I'm not a huge fan of gluten-containing grains. So wheat, barley, and rye, the vast majority of wheat grown within the United States is genetically modified so that it can resist the presence of Roundup. So Roundup is it's a weed killer. It basically can be sprayed on a large swath of grains like wheat, and it kills all the weeds that then would prevent the wheat from growing. The problem with that is that the presence of that glyphosate, that Roundup, then makes its way into our food supply, and it's found especially in children's cereals, believe it or not, breads, pastas, pretty much anything that's then made and processed from these grains. When Roundup makes its way to our intestinal tract, it absolutely destroys our GI. The cells that should be lined up right against one another like this begin to separate in the presence of Roundup, and that's called leaky gut. So that leads to autoimmunity, it can lead to inflammation, it can lead to GI gut problems like pain, loose stools, even constipation. So I would say fried food, gluten-containing grains should be at a bare minimum, if not nixed altogether. Processed food in general should be minimal. Anything that comes in a package, you should be trying to limit in the diet. Search the perimeter of the grocery store, fruits, veggies, meats, nuts, and seeds. Those are going to be the best for the GI tract. Oh, and then also we want to make sure that we have a decent amount of fiber coming through. Especially Americans, we are chronically deficient in getting enough fiber, and you can get plenty from eating whole vegetables.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Great.
Oh, and then one takeaway would be if you can ask yourself, did your grandparents eat that food as a kid? It's probably fine to be consuming. If they didn't know what the heck it was as a kid, don't have it.
What about lard? Where's that come into play?
Lard is actually perfectly fine. Really, the only fat that I like to have patients eliminate entirely is anything that's a trans fat. So we're looking at things like margarine. If you look on the back of a label and it says hydrogenated anything, partially hydrogenated, fully hydrogenated, a lot of times peanut butter will have that. The process of hydrogenation causes trans fats. That's been shown to lead to cardiovascular disease, potentially cancers. It basically gunks up our ability to detoxify. Everything else, lard, which contains saturated fat, coconut oil, which contains saturated fat, butter, which contains saturated fat, these types of fats that we've heard for so long that are bad for us, perfectly fine and in fact healthy to consume.
Okay, I'm glad I asked. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, so along the same lines, changing gears a little bit, what does the average person need to know about their poop?
Good question. Another multifaceted question, so we'll break it down, I guess, into a few large strokes. Color, it should be brown. If it's pale or very, very, very light brown, it could mean that you're not producing enough bile acids. The presence of bile helps to break down fats and help us absorb fats, as well as fat-soluble vitamins, so vitamin A, vitamin D, K, and vitamin E. If the poop is really, really light in color, you might not be producing enough bile, and it might be beneficial for you to take a bile acid or digestive enzyme. If the stool is black, it could mean that you're taking like an iron supplement or even potentially having like a greens powder, and that's just coming out in the stool. But if it's black and tarry, like really, really sticky, that can indicate that you have an upper GI bleed. So something like an ulcer in the stomach or in the small intestines. So the presence of it being black is not necessarily bad, but if it's black and sticky or tarry, that's problematic. If it's red, it could mean that you either had beets or you potentially have an internal hemorrhoid. So if you notice that you wipe and there's some blood on the tissue paper, if there's pain associated with the blood, then you know it's an external hemorrhoid. If it's red when you wipe, then it could be potentially that you have a lower GI bleed, but an internal hemorrhoid. But if it's really, really red, it could mean that you just had some beets too. So do a dietary catalog and see if you had anything like that within the last 24 hours. A yellow stool typically indicates that you have some degree of fat malabsorption. So again, another bile issue. Shape, the best is obviously more kind of like a long sausage type shape. Consistency, it should be solid, but not constipated, not too hard to pass. The amount of time that you should spend on the toilet should be about a minute. It should be very quick to pass the bowel movement. If they're kind of soft and pellet-like, you need some more hydration, you need to drink more water. If they come out too fast and they're loose or more diarrhea-like, then it means that you're probably not allowing enough time for the poop to for the food to pass through your system, and you may actually be having a malabsorption type thing, whether it's celiac disease, ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, or back to that small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. If the poop floats, that usually means that it has a higher amount of fat in it, which again indicates some degree of malabsorption. Normal poop should sink to the bottom of the toilet. And the frequency is you should be going about 1 to 2 times a day is kind of the ideal, the healthiness. If it's every other day, every once in a while, not a big deal, but really pooping once a day is very important. So I guess that was kind of a loaded question. There's a lot that goes into poop analysis.
Well, I appreciate your professionalism in explaining this often not talked about subject, but it's very important, obviously. One more question. So
Sure.
I hear about prebiotics, probiotics. What role do these play in the gut as far as digestion and elimination is concerned?
Sure. So probiotics have become hugely popular over the past number of years. The way that works is when we consume food, it goes down our esophagus, begins to be broken down in the stomach. The proteins, the carbs, and the fats are then passed into the small intestines. That's where it's further broken down, and we liberate amino acids from the proteins, glucose from the carbs, and fatty acids from the fats. Our intestinal tract then absorbs that along with vitamins and minerals. The only thing left over should be predominantly fiber and water. That gets passed into the large intestines, and here is where the bacteria that we want thrives and lives. It takes that fiber, consumes it, creates some gases, but then also other metabolic byproducts like butyric acid that gets absorbed into our system, influences our nervous system, our neurology in our brain, our immune system, has a whole host of different functions. And then we pass the stool. So it goes mouth, esophagus, stomach, small intestines for our absorption, and then fiber and water into the large intestines for the bacteria. Probiotics, when we take them orally, whether it comes from fermented dairy like yogurt or kefir, or we get it from a capsule, we're trying to influence the presence of that bacteria colonies in the large intestines. And probiotic strains can vary wildly. There can be really, really good probiotic strains and ones that really are not viable as soon as you consume them. That's a conversation for another time. The best way truly for us to influence the population of our gut bugs is to consume prebiotics. Those are things that contain dietary fiber, the food sources for our probiotics in the gut. We're going to be looking at things like root veggies, even some potatoes can do it. In fact, if you take a potato, cook it, and put it in the refrigerator, it increases something known as resistant starch. That resistant starch is like a buffet for the good bugs in our GI tract. Wow. Very interesting. Same goes for like green bananas, believe it or not. The moment the banana begins to turn from green to yellow, the sugar content increases and that resistant starch that's good for us goes down. Those are both good sources of prebiotics, but really any green leafy veggie, spinach, collard greens, kale, Swiss chard, Brussels sprouts, broccoli, all those types of good green leafy veggies have some good fermentable fiber that then acts as a prebiotic, the food, for our probiotics in the GI tract. The one thing I will say of caution is that a lot of times people with IBS will be very quick to take a probiotic capsule because probiotics are good for the GI tract. If the IBS is associated with SIBO or caused by SIBO, a small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, taking a probiotic on top of an overgrowth of bacteria can cause a lot of these people to actually do worse. So it's best to speak with a naturopath or a GI literate doctor who's able to identify the true root cause of IBS and then be able to introduce a probiotic if needed at the appropriate time.
Great. Yeah. Once again, I'm just floored with your ability to talk about the gut and understand it and explain it in just such simple terms. Thank you so much for the conversation about gut health today.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Thanks for having me again.
No problem. So finally, just to give our listeners a little bit more information about you, if someone were to become a new client, what does it look like for a consultation for them?
Sure. So the first visit, we usually sit down for about an hour. Let me go through everything. They come in with obviously chief complaints. There's a reason that they can't reach out to me in the first place. So we do a true in-depth dive into what caused those things to happen in the first place. When did it start? How bad is it? And so forth. But beyond that, I need a whole organic picture of what the person's lifestyle is like. How many hours of sleep are they getting a night? How frequently are they having a bowel movement? What is their digestion like? What's their diet like? What's their energy level like? I really try to get a full organic picture of who's sitting in front of me. From there, I'm able to craft a blood work form that I send them to have collected. So there's no one size fits all blood form, depending on the symptoms that they have and what I think may be going on. I like to have a biochemical analysis to then say, here's the nutrient deficiency, here's the pathogen that's in the system, here's the hormonal imbalance that exists. During the second visit, when we get back together, usually 2 weeks after the first, we go through everything that we talked about the first time, as well as what's yielded on the biochemistry from the lab work. And I say, you have this, that, and the other, and that's why you're experiencing these symptoms. At that point in time, I'm able to craft appropriate protocol with nutrients, bioidentical hormones, herbs, and I'm able to specifically tackle the root cause of their ailments or symptoms. It's usually by the third appointment, 6 weeks after the second, that they make significant improvements. And then we make some minor modifications from there. But it's usually by the third appointment that most patients say, I've been to many different doctors in the past and nobody was able to identify what's going on. And it's because I'm not just making empirical recommendations. I'm using what I know about human physiology and anatomy, pairing it with the biochemistry that I see on the labs, and then making a science-driven protocol specifically tailored to them.
Awesome. Well, you heard it from the gut detective himself, Dr. Castanho. He's ready to answer your questions, and if you have one, please type it into the comment box on your screen, and we'll be happy to get some answers for you. So please stay tuned for our next episode of Better Health Through Movement and Wholeness.
Thanks a lot for having me, Tom.
Yeah, it's a great job.